The October wind swept through the Ozark Mountains with a biting chill, carrying with it the scent of pine and decay. In the small town of Harrison, Arkansas, population 13,000, the Johnson family had become a ghost story, whispered about in diners and debated on cold nights when the fog settled thick over the hills. It had been 9 years since Robert Johnson, his wife Linda, and their 2 daughters, 10-year-old Ashley and 7-year-old Claire, vanished without a trace from their campsite near Buffalo National River. The family had driven up from Little Rock on a Friday afternoon in late September 2014, eager for a weekend of hiking and fishing. Robert, a high school history teacher with a passion for the outdoors, had planned the trip meticulously. Linda, a nurse at Arkansas Children's Hospital, had packed enough supplies for a small army. The girls were excited. Ashley had brought her new camera, a birthday gift she'd begged for all summer. Before we continue with this gripping story, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything, and it helps me bring you more incredible true stories like this one. They checked in at the ranger station at 4:47 p.m., according to the log. Ranger David Kowalski, let me correct that. Ranger David Patterson remembered them clearly. "Nice family," he'd told investigators later. "The dad asked about the best trails for kids. I recommended Steel Creek, told him to watch for copperheads this time of year." That was the last confirmed sighting. When Robert's brother called the Rangers on Monday morning, worried that Robert hadn't shown up for work and wasn't answering his phone, a search began immediately. What they found at the campsite sent chills through even the most seasoned search and rescue teams. The family's green Subaru Outback sat exactly where it should be, doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition. The tent was partially collapsed, one corner torn from its stake. Inside, sleeping bags lay rumpled but not disturbed in any violent way. Linda's purse sat on the picnic table, wallet intact with $247 in cash and all credit cards present. Robert's phone was there too, battery dead. But the family was gone. The initial search involved over 200 volunteers, K9 units, and helicopters equipped with thermal imaging. They combed through ravines, followed creek beds, and searched caves that dotted the limestone landscape like pockmarks. The dogs picked up a scent trail that led north from the campsite for roughly half a mile before simply stopping at a clearing near an old logging road. It was as if the family had evaporated into the mountain air. Ashley's camera was found on the second day, lying in a patch of wild blackberries about 300 yards from the tent. The memory card was still inside. The last photo, time-stamped 7:23 p.m. on that Friday night, showed Claire sitting by the campfire, roasting a marshmallow, her face glowing orange in the firelight. She was smiling. In the background, barely visible in the gathering darkness, was the edge of their tent and the dense tree line beyond. Investigators studied that photo for hours, looking for anything, a shadow, a figure, some clue to what happened next. As days turned into weeks, theories multiplied. Some believed a mountain lion had attacked, though no blood was found, and the odds of a single predator taking an entire family were astronomical. Others suspected foul play, a drifter, perhaps, or someone with sinister intentions who'd been camping nearby. The FBI came in, treating it as a potential abduction. They interviewed hundreds of people, tracked down every registered sex offender within a 100-mile radius, and analyzed cell tower data. Nothing. The most disturbing theory came from a local conspiracy theorist who ran a blog about missing persons in national forests. He believed the Johnsons had stumbled onto something they weren't meant to see. Drug runners using the remote trails, or worse. His posts gained traction online, spawning countless armchair detectives who dissected every detail of the case. But the police found no evidence of criminal activity in that area, no drug operations, no illegal camps. Linda's mother, Patricia Brennan, moved to Harrison to be closer to the search efforts. She spent her retirement savings posting reward flyers across 3 states. $100,000 for information leading to my family, they read, above 4 smiling faces. Patricia gave interviews to anyone who would listen, appeared on local news broadcasts, and even hired a private investigator who ultimately found nothing new. The case grew cold, then frozen. By year 3, the official searches had stopped. By year 5, even the private investigator had moved on to other cases. Patricia never stopped. She walked those trails herself, an old woman with a hiking stick and fierce determination, calling out their names until her voice went hoarse. Rangers would occasionally find her out there after dark, flashlight beam cutting through the trees, tears streaming down her weathered face. They'd drive her back to her small rental house on the edge of town, where the walls were covered with maps marked with colored pins, each representing a possible sighting, a lead, a hope that refused to die. The town of Harrison learned to live with the mystery. The Johnson disappearance became a cautionary tale parents told their children: stay close, stay safe, the mountains keep secrets. The campsite where they'd stayed was eventually reopened to the public, but people avoided it. It gained a reputation, whispered about, but never officially acknowledged. Camping reservations for that particular spot dropped to nearly 0. Robert's classroom at Little Rock Central High School was eventually reassigned to a young teacher fresh out of college. Linda's position at the hospital was filled after a respectful 6-month wait. The girls' school held a memorial service, planting 2 dogwood trees in the courtyard that bloomed white every spring. Life, as it always does, moved forward, but the questions remained, unanswered and haunting, like ghosts in the Ozark mist. Then, in October 2023, everything changed. Hank Brubaker was a bow hunter who'd been tracking deer in the Ozarks for 37 years. A retired electrician from Jasper, Arkansas, he knew these mountains better than most people knew their own backyards. He'd set up trail cameras at strategic points throughout his hunting territory, devices that captured images whenever motion triggered their sensors. These cameras were his secret weapon, helping him pattern deer movements and identify the best spots for his tree stands. On a crisp Thursday morning, Hank hiked to one of his most remote camera locations, roughly 6 miles from where the Johnson family had disappeared. The camera was strapped to a white oak tree, overlooking a natural game trail that deer used to move between feeding and bedding areas. He'd placed it there 2 years earlier and checked it every few months, downloading the images to see what had passed by. This particular camera had been acting strangely. The last time he'd checked it 3 months prior, the battery had been nearly dead despite being relatively new. He'd replaced it and thought nothing more of it. Now, as he approached the tree, he noticed something odd. The camera's angle had shifted, not dramatically, but enough that he could tell someone or something had bumped it. Hank pulled the SD card and scrolled through the images on his portable viewer, right there in the woods. Most were the usual suspects: deer, raccoons, a black bear that made him glad he hadn't been there at the time, and several coyotes. But then he froze. The image was dated September 28, 2014, 9 days after the Johnson family had vanished. The timestamp read 3:47 a.m. The camera had captured a figure moving through the frame, barely visible in the infrared glow. It was a child, small, wearing what appeared to be a nightgown or light-colored clothing. The image quality wasn't perfect. Trail cameras from 2014 weren't as sophisticated as modern ones, but Hank could make out enough detail to see that the child was barefoot and appeared to be running. His hands shook as he advanced to the next image. 5 seconds later, the camera had captured another shot. This time, 2 figures, both children, both small, both moving in the same direction, heading deeper into the wilderness, away from the trail, away from any campsite, away from civilization. Hank's stomach turned. He'd heard about the Johnson case, of course. Everyone in the region had. He fumbled for his cell phone, but there was no signal this deep in the mountains. He pulled the SD card, secured it in a waterproof case, and began the fastest hike of his life back to his truck. By that evening, the SD card was in the hands of the Boone County Sheriff's Department. By the next morning, the FBI's field office in Little Rock had been notified. By the weekend, the investigation that had been dormant for 9 years roared back to life with renewed intensity. Special Agent Nicole Raines had worked the Johnson case during its initial phase, before it went cold, and she'd moved on to other assignments. Now, a senior agent with the FBI's Violent Crimes Against Children Division, she found herself back in Arkansas, back in the Ozarks, staring at images that raised more questions than they answered. She sat in the Harrison Police Department's conference room, surrounded by old case files, new printouts of the trail camera images, and topographical maps of the search area. "The camera was here," she said, placing a red pin on the map. 6.3 miles northeast of the Johnson campsite. The terrain between the 2 points is extremely rugged. Steep ravines, dense undergrowth, multiple water crossings. For 2 small children to cover that distance in the dark, alone, seems almost impossible. Detective James Thornton, who'd been one of the original investigators on the case, leaned forward. He'd aged considerably in 9 years, his hair now mostly gray, deep lines etched around his eyes. "Unless they weren't alone," he said quietly. "Unless someone was with them, guiding them." But who and why? Agent Raines pulled up enhanced versions of the trail camera images on her laptop. The FBI's technical team had worked magic, sharpening details, adjusting contrast, analyzing every pixel. "Look here," she pointed to the second image. "This child, we believe it's Ashley based on height and build, is looking back over her shoulder. Her body language suggests urgency, but not terror. She's running, yes, but in a relatively controlled manner. Not like someone fleeing a threat." "What about the parents?" Thornton asked. "Any sign of them in subsequent images?" The camera continued taking photos for another 72 hours before the battery died completely, something we didn't realize in the original investigation because the timestamp corruption made us think it had failed earlier. There are no more human subjects after those 2 images of the children, just wildlife. Patricia Brennan received the news at her home in Harrison. She was 83 now. Her body weakened by years of grief, but her mind still sharp. When Detective Thornton showed her the enhanced photographs, she clutched them to her chest and wept, not tears of relief, but something more complicated. Here, finally, was proof that her granddaughters had survived at least 9 days after the disappearance, but it also meant they'd been out there, alone in the wilderness, in the middle of the night, running toward an unknown destination. "Where were they going?" Patricia whispered. "Why were they running? Where are they now?" The FBI established a new command center and brought in fresh resources. They used ground-penetrating radar in the area around Hank's trail camera, brought in cadaver dogs, and deployed drones with advanced thermal imaging capabilities. They interviewed Hank extensively, validating the camera's data logs and confirming it hadn't been tampered with. Everything checked out. The images were authentic. The timeline was solid. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A forensic geologist named Dr. Helen Wu examined the trail camera images with a focus not on the children, but on the background. In the enhanced second image, barely visible behind the running figures, she identified a distinctive rock formation, a limestone outcropping with a particular erosion pattern. Using geological surveys and satellite imagery, she pinpointed 3 possible locations within a 10-mile radius where that formation might exist. "These Ozark mountains are full of caves," Dr. Wu explained during a briefing. "Thousands of them, many unexplored or only partially mapped. If we can find this specific rock formation, it might lead us to a cave entrance. And if there's a cave, She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood. A cave could provide shelter. A cave could hide secrets. A cave could hold answers. The search teams deployed immediately, dividing into 3 groups to investigate each potential location. The terrain was punishing. October rains had made the ground treacherous, and the dense canopy blocked satellite signals, forcing teams to rely on traditional navigation methods. Days passed with no results. The first 2 locations proved to be false matches. The rock formations were similar but not exact. But the third location, a remote hollow accessed only by bushwhacking through thick vegetation, proved different. On the evening of October 27, 2023, a search team led by a young park ranger named Thomas Vega found it. The limestone outcropping matched Dr. Wu's analysis perfectly, and behind it, obscured by decades of overgrowth, was a cave entrance. Not large, barely 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, but definitely there. Thomas radioed the discovery immediately. Within hours, a full tactical team had assembled. They brought portable lighting, rope systems, and medical supplies. Nobody knew what they might find inside, but after 9 years, hope and dread were equally balanced on a knife's edge. Special Agent Rains insisted on being part of the initial entry team. As they cleared the vegetation from the cave mouth, her headlamp revealed smooth limestone walls and a passage that sloped downward into darkness. The air that emerged was cool and stale, carrying the mineral smell of ancient rock. She squeezed through the opening, followed by 3 other agents and 2 experienced cave rescue specialists. The passage opened into a larger chamber, about 30 feet in. Their lights revealed a space roughly the size of a small bedroom, with a ceiling high enough to stand in comfortably. And there, scattered across the cave floor, were unmistakable signs of human presence. A child's shoe, disintegrated by time and moisture, but still recognizable. Remnants of fabric that might have been clothing, and most heartbreaking of all, a small plastic water bottle, the kind that would have been packed in a child's lunchbox. But there were no remains, no bodies. The cave continued deeper, branching into multiple passages that the team would need to map and explore systematically. As Agent Rains documented the initial chamber, her radio crackled with a transmission from another team member who'd moved into one of the side passages. "You need to see this," the voice said, tight with emotion. "There's something back here. It's a camp. Someone lived here." The passage opened into an even larger chamber, and what they found there stunned the entire investigation team. Someone had created a makeshift dwelling in the cave, a survival camp that showed signs of careful planning and long-term habitation. There were remnants of a fire pit, positioned directly under a natural chimney in the cave ceiling that would have vented smoke. Flat rocks had been arranged as sleeping platforms, and most incredibly, scratched into the cave wall with what must have been tremendous effort, were words. "We are safe. We wait. Dad told us." The letters were crude but clearly intentional, carved at a height that suggested a child's hand. Agent Rains felt her throat tighten as she traced the words with her gloved fingers. The message was undated, but forensic analysis would later determine that the scratches were consistent with being made within weeks of the family's disappearance. The investigation shifted entirely. This wasn't just about finding bodies anymore. This was about understanding what had happened in those first weeks after the Johnsons vanished. Why would the children be alone in this cave? Where were their parents? And most puzzling of all, what did Dad told us mean? Over the next week, teams carefully excavated and documented every inch of the cave system. They found more evidence of habitation, animal bones that showed marks consistent with being cooked over fire. A broken pocket knife that was later identified as belonging to Robert Johnson through serial number records. Scraps of a tent that matched the material of the family's camping tent from the original campsite, and in a small alcove, protected from moisture, a child's drawing on a piece of bark showing 4 stick figures holding hands. but they found no human remains. Not in the main chambers, not in the side passages, not in any of the deeper recesses of the extensive cave system. It was as if the family had simply evaporated once again, this time from inside the mountain itself. The forensic timeline began to take shape. Based on the evidence, investigators theorized that the family had reached this cave sometime in the first few days after their disappearance. They'd set up a survival camp, suggesting they were hiding or waiting for something. The children had clearly been there. The shoe, the drawing, the message on the wall all confirmed that. But what had happened next? Why would they leave? And where would they go? Dr. Benjamin Ashford, a criminal psychologist brought in to consult on the case, offered a disturbing theory. If Robert left that message for his daughters, Dad told us, it suggests he was planning to leave them temporarily. Perhaps he was going for help or supplies. Maybe he and Linda both left, intending to return. But something prevented them from coming back. The question is, did the girls eventually leave the cave to search for their parents, or did someone find them? Hank Brubaker's trail camera had captured the children running at 3:47 a.m., 9 days after the disappearance. The cave was approximately 3 miles from the camera location. If the girls had left the cave and been heading somewhere specific, where and why in the middle of the night? Agent Rains spent hours studying topographical maps, trying to think like 2 frightened children who'd been left alone in a cave for over a week. She traced possible routes, considered water sources, imagined what might have compelled them to leave their shelter in the darkness. Then she noticed something that made her pulse quicken. 3.7 miles from Hank's trail camera, in the direction the girls had been running, was an old abandoned homestead. According to county records, it had belonged to a family named Whitmore until the early 1990s, when they'd sold the land to the National Park Service. The buildings had been left to decay naturally per park policy, but they would still have offered shelter. More importantly, according to historical maps, there was a well on the property, a source of fresh water. They were heading for that homestead, Rains said with certainty during the next briefing. 2 scared kids, alone for days, running out of whatever supplies were in the cave. Maybe they saw the buildings during daylight and decided to try to reach them. Or maybe Robert had mentioned it to them, told them to go there if something happened to him. The search teams mobilized again, this time focusing on the old Whitmore homestead. What they found there made national headlines and brought the 9-year-old mystery crashing toward a conclusion that no one had anticipated. The homestead consisted of 3 structures, a main house, a barn, and a small shed. All were in advanced states of decay, roofs partially collapsed, walls sagging. The search team approached cautiously, unsure what they might find. The front door of the main house hung askew on rusted hinges. Inside, decades of leaves had blown in through broken windows, and wildlife had made the space their own. But in what had once been the kitchen, they found evidence that stopped everyone cold. Fresh scratches on the doorframe, much fresher than the building's decades of abandonment, and on what remained of the wooden floor, barely visible under layers of debris, were marks that suggested something heavy had been dragged repeatedly across the boards. The forensic team documented everything, then began carefully removing the accumulated detritus. Beneath 3 inches of rotted leaves and animal nests, they found a trapdoor. It was small, maybe 3 feet square, cut into the floorboards. The edges showed fresh tool marks, suggesting it had been opened relatively recently, certainly within the last decade. Agent Rains felt her heart hammering as the team carefully lifted the door. Below was a root cellar, common in old homesteads from that era. The space was small, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with walls of stacked stone and a dirt floor. A ladder led down into the darkness. Agent Rains descended first, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The cellar was empty except for old mason jars lined against one wall, their contents long since rotted away. But scratched into the stone wall, at about waist height, were more words. This time a single sentence in letters that looked more desperate, more frantic than the ones in the cave. "Gone to find water. Please find us. Ashley Johnson." The date, scratched below the message, read, OCT 7-2014. Agent Rains stood in that root cellar for a long moment, trying to comprehend the timeline. The family had vanished September 19th. They'd reached the cave at some point in the following days. The girls had left the cave and been captured by the trail camera on September 28th, heading toward this homestead. They'd reached it, sheltered in the root cellar, and stayed there until at least October 7th, 19 days after the initial disappearance. And then they'd left again, searching for water because the well must have been dry or inaccessible. "They survived almost 3 weeks," Rain said softly, her voice carrying a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. 2 children, alone in these mountains, and they survived. But where had they gone from there, and where were they now? The FBI deployed every resource at their disposal. They brought in additional trail cameras, reviewed historical satellite imagery, interviewed everyone who'd been in the area during October 2014, and published the enhanced trail camera photos publicly, hoping someone, somewhere, might have seen something. The media coverage was intense. National news programs ran special segments, podcasts devoted entire episodes to the case, and social media exploded with theories and speculation. Then 3 days after finding the root cellar message, a woman named Diane Fletcher walked into the Boone County Sheriff's Department with a story that would finally break the case wide open. Diane was a social worker from Springfield, Missouri, about 100 miles from where the Johnsons had vanished. She was 67 years old, retired, and had been following the news coverage with increasing unease. Finally, she'd made the 2-hour drive to Arkansas because, she said, she had information that might be relevant. In October 2014, Diane began, sitting across from Agent Rains and Detective Thornton. "I was working for Missouri Family Services. One day, I'd have to check my records for the exact date, but it was mid-October. A ranger from the Mark Twain National Forest contacted us about 2 children they'd found." Agent Rains leaned forward. "What do you mean, found?" "They'd been walking along Highway 19, about 15 miles inside Missouri. 2 little girls, filthy, exhausted, suffering from exposure and dehydration. The ranger said they'd been in pretty bad shape. He took them to the hospital in Houston, Missouri. That's standard procedure." "Did they give names?" Diane hesitated. "That's the thing. They wouldn't speak. Not a word. The doctors examined them, treated them for dehydration and malnutrition, but they absolutely refused to communicate. No names, no information about where they'd come from, nothing. We tried everything. Child psychologists, play therapy, art therapy. Complete silence." "What happened to them?" "After 3 days in the hospital, they were turned over to family services. That's when I got involved. I placed them in an emergency foster home with a family I'd worked with before. Good people, experienced with traumatized kids. But here's where it gets strange. About 4 days after I placed them, I got a call from the foster mother. The girls were gone, just vanished in the middle of the night." Detective Thornton's pen stopped moving across his notepad. "Gone?" "The foster mother swore she'd locked all the doors, but when she checked on them the next morning, the window in their room was open and they were gone. We filed a report with the Missouri State Police, but they were never found. At the time, we assumed they'd run away to return to whoever they'd been with before. Maybe someone was abusing them, and they were protecting that person. It happens more than you'd think. But now, seeing these trail camera photos, seeing that little girl's face," Diane's voice cracked, "I think those were the Johnson children. I think I had them in my care for less than a week, and I lost them." The implications were staggering. If Diane was right, Ashley and Claire Johnson had somehow made it from the Ozarks of Arkansas to southern Missouri, a journey of over 40 miles through some of the most rugged terrain in the region. They'd survived for weeks before being found, spent a few days in the system, and then vanished again. But why? Why wouldn't they have identified themselves? Why would they run from people trying to help them? Agent Rains requested all of Diane's records from October 2014. The files were sparse. Incomplete medical records, a few photos taken at the hospital, and brief notes from the foster placement. But when Rains saw the hospital photos, she knew with absolute certainty. Despite the dirt, the hollow eyes, the ravages of weeks in the wilderness, the faces were unmistakably Ashley and Claire Johnson. "We need to find that foster family," Rains said, "and we need to understand why these girls ran. What were they running from, or what were they running toward?" The foster family, Alan and Rebecca Grant, still lived in Houston, Missouri. When investigators contacted them, they agreed to meet immediately. The Grants were in their 70s now, retired from fostering, but they remembered those two silent girls vividly. "We'd fostered probably 50 kids over 20 years, Rebecca said, sitting in her living room with her husband beside her. But those two, they were different. The way they looked at each other, like they were having entire conversations without words, and they were terrified, absolutely terrified, but not of us, of something else." "Did they ever speak? Ever give you any indication of what they were afraid of?" Agent Rains asked. Alan cleared his throat. "The night before they disappeared, I thought I heard one of them crying. I went to check on them, and when I opened the door, they were both awake, sitting on the bed holding hands. The older one, I guess that was Ashley, looked at me and said just 3 words, only words we ever heard from either of them." "What did she say?" "She said, 'He's still hunting.' Then they both just stared at me. I asked who was hunting for what, but they went silent again. I reported it to Diane the next morning, but by then they were already gone." The investigation shifted once more. "He's still hunting," suggested the girls were fleeing from someone specific, someone they believed was pursuing them. But who? The original investigation had cleared every potential suspect in the area. There had been no evidence of any other campers, no suspicious vehicles, no reports of anyone unusual in the region during that time. Agent Rains returned to the evidence from the cave. She'd been so focused on what was there that she hadn't thought carefully about what wasn't. The cave shelter had been carefully constructed, showing knowledge of survival techniques. Robert Johnson had been an experienced outdoorsman, but the level of preparation suggested something more than a spontaneous flight from their campsite. It suggested they'd planned to hide, known they would need to hide, perhaps even chosen that specific cave before the camping trip. She pulled up Robert's background check from the original investigation. High school history teacher, clean record, no debts, no known enemies. But as she dug deeper, going beyond the initial surface check, she found something interesting. Before becoming a teacher, Robert had served in the army for 6 years, including 2 tours in Afghanistan. He'd been a combat medic, honorably discharged in 2008. His military records were mostly routine, but there was one incident report from his second tour. In 2007, Robert's unit had been involved in a firefight that resulted in civilian casualties, a tragedy of war, investigated and cleared with no fault assigned to any American soldiers. But Robert had filed a detailed incident report describing his medical treatment of the wounded, including civilians. And in that report, he'd named a local Afghan translator who'd been working with the unit, a man who'd been injured in the crossfire. Agent Rains tracked down Robert's former commanding officer, now retired and living in Virginia. Colonel Michael Brennan, no relation to Linda's family, agreed to speak with her by phone. "Robert Johnson, of course I remember him. Good soldier, excellent medic. Took the civilian casualties hard, though. We all did, but Robert especially. He kept saying we'd made enemies that day, that someone would want revenge. Did anything come of that? Any threats? Not officially. But Robert was convinced that one of the injured men, not the translator, someone else, a relative of one of the casualties, had sworn some kind of blood oath. You know how it is over there, tribal justice, family honor. We didn't take it too seriously. Lot of guys came back with similar stories, worried about revenge that never materialized. But what if it had materialized? What if someone from that day in Afghanistan had somehow tracked Robert Johnson to Arkansas? It seemed far-fetched, but Agent Rains had learned that the most bizarre explanations were sometimes the true ones. She contacted the FBI's counterterrorism division and requested a full workup on everyone connected to that 2007 incident in Afghanistan. The results took 2 weeks, but when they arrived, they painted a disturbing picture. One of the civilians killed that day had been a member of a prominent family in the Helmand province. His younger brother, Nasir Ahmadi, had been 17 at the time, injured but not seriously. According to military intelligence, Nasir had become radicalized in the years following the incident, joining a militant group before eventually disappearing from intelligence radar in 2012. His last known location had been Pakistan, but after that, nothing. Until Agent Rains found an immigration record. In March 2014, a man matching Nasir's description had entered the United States on a student visa, claiming to be enrolling in a university in California. But according to the university, he'd never shown up. The visa had been flagged as suspicious, but in the massive backlog of immigration enforcement, it had never been fully investigated. And the address Nasir had listed on his visa application, an apartment complex in Little Rock, Arkansas, less than an hour from where Robert Johnson taught school. The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture that was both clearer and more horrifying than anyone had imagined. Robert must have somehow discovered that Nasir had found him. Maybe he'd seen him, maybe he'd been warned, or maybe it was just the paranoia of a soldier who'd never stopped looking over his shoulder. Whatever the trigger, Robert had decided his family needed to disappear, not just for a day or a week, but potentially for much longer. The camping trip had been a ruse, a way to get his family out of their normal routine and into terrain he knew well. The cave had been a prepared shelter, somewhere he'd scouted beforehand. He'd moved his family there, set up their survival camp, and then, Agent Rains believed, he'd gone back out, either to confront Nasir or to lead him away from where his wife and daughters were hiding. "That's why they waited," she said during a team briefing. The girl's message said, "Dad told us. He told them to wait in that cave, to stay hidden, that he would come back." But he never did. After more than a week, they ran out of supplies, ventured out, and headed for the only other shelter they knew, that old homestead. They stayed there as long as they could, but eventually they had to keep moving. That's when they crossed into Missouri and were found. "But why wouldn't they tell anyone who they were?" Detective Thornton asked. "Why the silence?" "Because their father had told them to stay hidden, to trust no one. He'd probably told them that someone was hunting them, that speaking their names would bring danger. They were following their father's last instructions, even though he never came back. And when they ran from the foster home, they were still running, still following what their dad had taught them. Don't stay anywhere long, keep moving, trust nobody." The FBI issued a nationwide alert with the Johnson girls' photos. Now age progressed to show what they would look like at 19 and 16. The story was everywhere. News broadcasts, social media, missing persons websites. Somewhere, Agent Rains believed, Ashley and Claire Johnson were still alive, still out there, still running from a threat that might no longer exist. Because when investigators finally tracked down Nasir Ahmadi, they found him in a cemetery in Oklahoma. He died in a car accident in November 2014, less than a month after the Johnsons' disappearance. The accident report was straightforward. He'd been driving too fast on a rural highway, lost control, and hit a tree. He'd been alone in the vehicle. But in his motel room, investigators found a map of Arkansas with several locations circled, including the Buffalo National River area. They found photographs of the Johnson family, school photos of the girls, a picture of Robert from the high school website, and they found a journal, written partly in Pashto and partly in English, detailing Nasir's plan to make Robert Johnson understand loss by taking everything from him, just as Nasir had lost everything. The timeline suggested that Nasir had been in the Ozarks during the time the Johnsons were in their cave. Had Robert confronted him? Had they fought? Had Robert killed Nasir in self-defense, then fled, never returning to his family because he feared leading investigators, or other enemies, back to them? Or had Nasir found and killed Robert and Linda, never discovering the hidden children before dying himself in a random accident? The truth about what happened to Robert and Linda Johnson remained elusive. Despite extensive searches of the area around the cave, no remains were found. No evidence of violence, no sign of their fate. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only their daughters and a legacy of mystery. Then, on a cold November evening in 2023, a woman walked into the FBI field office in Seattle, Washington. She was 19 years old, tall and thin, with dark hair and careful eyes. She asked to speak with someone about the Johnson case, and within minutes, Agent Nicole Raines was on a video call from Arkansas. "My name is Ashley Johnson," the young woman said, her voice steady but quiet, "and I need to tell you what happened to my family." Agent Raines flew to Seattle the next morning. With her was Patricia Brennan, now 84 and frail, who'd held on to hope for 9 years that her granddaughters were alive. The reunion took place in a conference room at the FBI office, and when Patricia saw Ashley, older, hardened by years of survival, but unmistakably her granddaughter, she wept in a way that spoke of grief and joy so intermixed they couldn't be separated. Claire was there too, 16 now, quieter than her sister but equally determined. Together, the two young women told a story that answered some questions while opening entirely new ones. Their father had indeed hidden them in the cave, telling them he needed to take care of something and would be back within a week. He'd left them with supplies and clear instructions: stay hidden, stay quiet, speak to no one. He'd told them about the threat, explained in terms a 10-year-old and 7-year-old could understand that a bad man was looking for them, someone from a war far away who wanted to hurt their family. Days passed, then a week, then more. They'd rationed their food, drank from a small stream that ran through the cave system, and waited. But their father never came back. Neither did their mother, who'd gone with him despite his insistence she stay behind. After 12 days, with their food nearly gone, they'd made the decision to leave. "We remembered Dad talking about an old homestead," Ashley said, her hands folded tightly on the table. "He'd hiked past it years before and mentioned it to us. We thought maybe he'd gone there, or maybe we could find help, so we left the cave at night. Dad said to always move at night if we had to move, and we walked. It took us most of the night to find it. They'd sheltered in the root cellar, but the well was dry and they couldn't figure out how to work the pump. After 9 more days, desperately thirsty, they'd set out again. This time they'd followed a road, hoping to find civilization. Instead, they'd collapsed from dehydration and been found by the forest ranger." "Why didn't you tell anyone who you were?" Patricia asked, her voice breaking. Claire spoke for the first time. "Dad made us promise. He said if we told anyone our names, the bad man would find us. He said we had to trust only him and Mom, so we didn't talk. We thought if we stayed quiet, if we kept the secret, Dad would find us and everything would be okay. But he never did. And when they'd been placed in the foster home, that first night in real beds with real food, they'd almost relaxed, almost believed they were safe. Until Ashley had overheard the foster father on the phone, talking about calling the police, about trying to identify them. The fear had returned in force. If the police got involved, if their names were out there, the bad man would know. So they'd run again. For 9 years, they'd been running. They'd learned to survive on the margins of society, moving from city to city, taking odd jobs that paid cash, staying in shelters or on the streets. They'd changed their names, changed their appearance, and never stayed anywhere long enough to form connections. They'd seen news reports about their disappearance over the years, but had been too afraid to come forward. "What changed?" Agent Rains asked gently. "Why come forward now?" Ashley looked at her sister, and some silent communication passed between them. "We saw the news coverage. We saw the pictures from the cave, the message we'd left. And we realized we're tired. We've been running our whole lives from someone who was probably never even chasing us. We're tired of being afraid. We want to know what happened to our parents. And—" her voice finally cracked. "We want to go home, whatever that means now." The DNA tests were a formality. Everyone in the room knew these were the Johnson girls. Patricia held her granddaughters and spoke to them about their mother, about the family they'd lost, about the grandmother who'd never stopped searching. She told them about the dogwood trees at their old school, still blooming every spring, about the reward posters she'd hung in 3 states, about the hope she'd carried like a candle that refused to go out, even in the strongest winds. The investigation into Robert and Linda Johnson's fate continued, though Agent Rains suspected the truth would never be fully known. Most likely, they'd encountered Nasir somewhere in those rugged mountains, and whatever confrontation occurred had ended badly for all of them. Perhaps their remains were out there still, hidden in some ravine or cave that would never be found. Or perhaps they'd escaped, lived under assumed names somewhere, always planning to reunite with their daughters, but never able to find them again. But for Ashley and Claire, the running was over. They began the long, difficult process of reclaiming their identities, working with therapists to process 9 years of trauma and survival. Patricia moved them into her small house in Harrison, and slowly, tentatively, they began to rebuild something that resembled a normal life. The story captivated the nation, not because of its resolution, which raised as many questions as it answered, but because of what it revealed about the human capacity for resilience. 2 children, lost in the wilderness, had survived against impossible odds. They'd stayed loyal to their father's instructions, even when those instructions kept them running for nearly a decade, and they'd finally found the courage to stop running, to step back into the light, to reclaim the names they'd been given at birth. Hank Brubaker, the hunter, whose trail camera had inadvertently documented a single frame of their journey, met the sisters at a community gathering organized to welcome them home. He shook their hands, this old outdoorsman who'd spent decades in those mountains, and told them they were the toughest survivors he'd ever heard of. "You walked out of hell," he said simply, "and you walked back. That takes a special kind of strength." The town of Harrison, which had lived with the mystery of the Johnson disappearance for 9 years, slowly adjusted to the reality of their return. There were challenges. The girls struggled with trust, with crowds, with the simple mechanics of documented life in modern America. But there were also moments of grace. Ashley enrolled in community college to study emergency medicine, inspired by memories of her father's work as a combat medic. Claire found solace in art therapy, creating haunting pieces that depicted forests and caves and the long roads between. On the first anniversary of their return, the Johnson sisters and their grandmother hiked back to the cave where it had all begun. They went with a small group: Agent Rains, Detective Thornton, and a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery. At the entrance to the cave, Ashley placed a photograph of her family, all 4 of them together, taken weeks before the camping trip that changed everything. It was sealed in a weatherproof case, anchored to the rock. "For Mom and Dad," she said softly, "so they're not forgotten, so this place remembers all of us, not just what we lost." They stood there, as the October wind rustled through the pines, carrying with it the scent of approaching winter. The Ozarks kept their secrets well, and this mountain would likely keep Robert and Linda Johnson's final moments hidden forever. But their daughters had emerged from the darkness, had survived the unsurvivable, and had finally found their way home. As they walked back down the trail, Claire reached for her sister's hand, a gesture they'd made 1,000 times in 9 years of running. But this time, they weren't running from something. They were walking toward something, a future uncertain, but no longer defined solely by fear. Behind them, the cave entrance slowly disappeared from view, swallowed by the forest, keeping its mysteries while releasing its survivors. The hunter's trail camera that had captured those crucial images sat in an evidence locker now, its work done, its accidental documentation of 2 small figures running through the darkness, having changed the course of an investigation and brought closure to a family that had learned to live without it. In those pixelated infrared images, frozen at 3:47 a.m. on September 28, 2014, Ashley and Claire Johnson had been captured mid-stride, mid-journey, mid-survival. They'd been running then. They'd been running for years after, but they weren't running anymore.